Dear listeners, we spend so much time trying to fix what we think is broken. We chase better habits, clearer thinking, stronger willpower. But what if the real work is not about fixing at all? What if it's all about seeing the structures that we have been living inside without even knowing they are there? So, welcome to Mind Means Machine. I'm your host, Avik, and this is a podcast where we slow down enough to notice what's actually happening beneath the surface of our thoughts, our patterns, and the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. And today I'm talking to a very lovely guest. Please welcome Lincoln Stoller. So, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm curious as to what's going to happen with us.
Definitely. But before that, I'll definitely request you if you can share a bit about yourself and your journey. So, it'll really be helpful.
Well, they say you should have a child's view of the world. And I think as I get older, my view is getting more and more childish because as I get more opinionated, I also find more opportunities.
Okay.
And I find myself reacting against the boundaries that people naturally erect in terms of defining themselves. So I am professionally a psychotherapist, but I'm also a theoretical physicist. And in psychotherapy, I deal openly with people's issues. And I also make a point of being a coach because I want people to get out of the mindset of illness and limitation and start to think about open frontiers and opportunities and abilities. And then as a physicist, I deal with very structured people and rather structured problems. But I tend to be creative, which is good for therapy because you try and create something new. And it's not so good with physics because most physics is conservative and most physicists are conservative.
Okay.
But you mentioned, how do we create things for ourselves? And that's a good example. Are you a person who creates and maintains the container of who you are and what you believe in? Or are you an open-minded person who's willing to change and consider reality differently? And like I say, as I get older, I get less tolerant of people who are stuck in one box or another because it's limiting and it's self-limiting. It limits who you can talk about, who you can talk to, how you interact with people, what you aspire to do, even how you see your past. So that's not a very historical introduction, but I've now turned 70.
Hmm?
I think a lot about all the people I've encountered, and I'm finally becoming very judgmental. I think judgment is very important. It's the question of deciding between various options. And I regret losing, in general, a lot of connections with people. I don't understand why people let their connections drop off in their life as if they were just animals in a cage moving from one cage to the next. But so it is. Very few people maintain connection. Very few. I have one of my current projects is a book about my
Mhm.
father. It's on a Kickstarter campaign. These campaigns, you send emails to people and ask them to look at it. So I go through and I've done like a half a dozen of these campaigns. And every time I go through my address book of 1,500 people and think about each of them. And it sort of saddens me that very few of those people, except the family, are still in connection with me. And I send them emails and never hear from them. I don't understand. How can you build a future without always being open to change? But most people are not always open to change. So I keep wandering off into philosophical attitudes. So really that's who I am now. I'm a therapist and a researcher and a parent. I live on the West Coast in Canada, but I'm a US citizen and a Canadian citizen. And I used to travel a lot, but I'm not that interested in travel. It's kind of annoying with all the details that it entails. And I occasionally go and climb moderate mountains around here, which gets, quite a lot of exercise. It's a lot of steep territory here, and I don't get a lot of exercise. So I just came back from one of my many failed attempts at climbing a mountain. You get rained out. I do these things alone. And yeah, so now you have to tell me what you think your audience wants me to talk about or what you want to talk about.
So first of all, definitely I would love to ask you on this that so when people come to you thinking of looking for a change, right? So what is the misconception you see? The biggest misconception.
Well, that depends. If they come with a problem, the misconception is usually the problem. In other words, they've conceived of it in some form and they've encountered a block or a resistance, and they're often looking for a solution to the problem as they see it. And the problem really is how they see it, not what they see. Because everybody, if they're sincere, has tried to solve their problem in the way they believe is appropriate. And if they've come to me, they've had trouble achieving it. So for those people, the problem is how they foresee the problem, right? The difficulty is how they foresee the problem. And of course, it's hard to convince someone to look at something differently when they've already tried as hard as they could to look at it as broadly as possible, which may not be very broad, but nevertheless, it's what they've tried to do. So you're working against preconceptions. So that's, if a person comes with a problem, their preconceptions are usually a large part of their problem. And what they can't see or even conceive of is most likely an opportunity. It's easy to say for me. And my job is basically to convince them that there's truth there. On the other hand, if they come with opportunities, they're a high performance person in a successful position, then their problem is different. Then they're looking sort of over the horizon in terms of what they might encounter. And they're looking at the small irritations that they have in their life and trying to avoid them to, optimize their potential and reward and minimize the annoyance. If they're a high performance person, their annoyances are usually with low performance situations, restrictions, failure to be recognized or given the right resources. And so I would have a different role. And in those cases, I might suggest a person look at their weaknesses. What are they missing? What are they historically annoyed by, triggered by, hung up about? What problems do they create, or what role do they have in the problems they create? What are they attached to? Money can be a big attachment. Relationships can be a big attachment. Anything you invest in or feel a need of can become a big attachment. And again, it's hard to release those things. You try to find solutions within the context of your investments, and clearly that, it's like trying to get to a destination by driving along a road that doesn't get there, but you think it does. So how do you convince somebody that they're on the wrong road? Now, clearly, I deal with people who have some desire for input. I'm not just confronting, we see in politics partisanship where people think they know the truth and they're not interested in hearing another point of view, and that generally generates conflict and disagreement, and nobody's interested in listening. But in my profession, people are generally interested in listening because they're paying by the minute, which is, I guess, good. There are people who are willing to change, people who are unwilling to change, and then there are people who fight with each other. And I guess the best situation is to be with people who are willing to change, if that's your role. So that's what I do. And I think it's great. And like I say, I have less and less tolerance for boundaries and restrictions and closed-mindedness.
And it's interesting, like how we carry these invisible maps of ourselves, and sometimes the hardest part is like it's creating the new line, new map, and realizing that we have been holding for all along. So uh, from that perspective, I definitely want to come to our daily part, our everyday life, right? So someone suppose is listening right now, maybe sitting with their kind of familiar frustration or a recurring loop that they cannot seem to break it. What might they notice if they look at it through this lens of structure instead of failure? What do you say on this?
I try to break things down. That's my analytical
Okay.
nature. And one of the things that I see as basic is being honest, which is really much more of a spectrum than it is a boundary. There's lots of things you can be honest about in different degrees, but the more honest you can be, the more you see, because there are different points of view. So honesty also means seeing other points of view, not just the right point of view. So I think that's an important ingredient to begin with, to commit to honesty. And, I think a lot of people will say, yes, I'm honest, except I'm obliged to take this role in these conditions and I have to play that role. And I'm not entirely comfortable with it. So, there's a point of sticking and resistance and dishonesty. I mean, fundamentally, on a personal or psychological level, there's some dishonesty that's a problem. And the next thing I would say is commitment. You have to be committed to change, which means you have to be sort of courageous to do things that may not be or appear to be immediately rewarding. Well, you have to be committed to be honest.
Okay.
So a commitment, an honesty, and there's something else. I think you have to be creative, which also means sort of visionary, which means sort of spiritual, which means have a notion of what's beyond what you can see. I mean, basically, creativity is just going to places you haven't been, professionally, geographically, in any way. So if you look at your life in those terms, I think the next step beyond being honest and creative and committed is to recognize that you are responsible for the situation you're in. Now, you may feel that you had no choice, or you were born into it, or socioeconomically you're stuck in it. Okay, but still, you've accepted it to some degree and made an attempt to prevail. But that can be a limitation, you know. So you say to this person, well, okay, you've achieved a certain amount of success in this role, and now you're trying to do better, but maybe the role is limiting you. So the usual reaction is, I can't change the role. I would sacrifice too much. I've invested this much and I've achieved this reputation and these skills. To abandon them would be to lose opportunities and security.
That's
And okay, but if you want to change and you want novelty and a new opportunity and you want to become something greater, it's almost required that you'll have to leave something behind. I mean, you know, there's a Buddhist saying that you can't add to a cup that's already full. So you do want a fresh perspective, and that comes with fear and uncertainty and risk. And if you're serious about change, I think you have to embrace that. And it also comes with failure. Failure is not bad. Failure means you've now addressed several options and determined which are the wrong ones. I think that's actually a much more educational position to be in than having luckily chosen the right decision and now you are proceeding with the same ideas you had before down what is usually a narrower path. So I'm a big advocate of learning and failing, committing, testing, and regrouping and trying again. You have to make that a life process if you're going to go through change and learn and reorganize yourself. So basically an explorer, and I encourage other people to be explorers too, in many ways.
so if
You know,
you
and I don't know how that lands, but
no, I totally understand, but I mean, like you said, from there, I definitely want if you can share kind of suggestion or the guide for the listeners on this. So what that will be? I mean, if you have to give one advice.
well, usually to appreciate your problems. So let's see. One of my clients is a wealthy banker, and his problems are the people he has to be responsible to who are not as qualified as he is, not as they don't perform as well as he does, yet they're his superiors. So he has a problem with them, how to deal with them. He doesn't see them as very effective or positive. And the other is his past. One of the reasons that he's successful is he felt unrecognized by his parents. He was sent away to boarding school when he was a child, had dealt with parents who had negative attitudes in general, and he's trying to distance himself from those and overcome those and do better. But still, the problem is that that is his role model, and it has left scars and impacts. And
Exactly.
he's, you know, triggered by people who behave like his parents from his memories of being a child. And we all have that. So what I'm saying is, yes, it's easy to recognize problems, but the important and perpetually difficult thing is to deal with them as things you've accepted and created into your life and most likely are attached to, which are, well, they're not positive, but they're things from which you can learn. So how do you learn to deal with a person who's unhelpful, negative, and destructive when they might be your parent, your child, your partner, your boss, your
Exactly.
associate, your client? Are they willing to engage you? And if not, how do you deal with them? And if not, how do you stop dealing with
Got it. Amazing. So what I'll do is I'll put all the details, everything into the show notes. But before that, if you can share, like if listeners wants to connect with you, how they can connect. So
it? Well, I have several levels. You know, it's called the sales funnel. I have a blog that's free and weekly. Although I've been doing these podcasts and I throw links to them in all the time. So sometimes multiple posts a week. And it's at well, my website is mindstrengthbalance.com. The blog is at Substack, mindstrengthbalance.substack.com. And then there's a paid version, which I made a mistake there. The free version is monthly, the paid version is weekly.
Mhm.
And these are long posts. And I don't know, it's kind of funny because sometimes I just veer into physics and I seem to lose subscribers, but I'm very interested in that. So the topics ping pong back and forth between psychology and physics and social issues. And mindstrengthbalance.com is the therapy site and the coaching site. And I have a dozen books, which you find on the links to the books tab. And those are on sleep, hypnosis, dreaming, and learning, basically. I think those books are fairly accessible. They're written as self-help books, basically. So there you can buy them. Some are digital, some are audio. And also, to people don't really know what hypnosis is. It's basically just deep immersive thinking. And so you'll see on my products page lists of hypnotic inductions on different topics, which do not focus on illness. They mostly focus on creativity. So some of them for sale, some of them are free. You download them, they're audio files. So that's where you would start, mindstrengthbalance.com.
So, dear listeners, what I'll do is I'll put all the links, details, everything into the show notes so that it will be easier for you to reach out to Lincoln. And thank you so much for sharing, Lincoln, your details, everything, and also the guidance as well. And for everyone, I have to say, I mean, we don't have to break ourselves open to growth. Like sometimes we just need to see what is already there and let that seeing do the work. So, with this, definitely, thank you so much for slowing down with us today. And with this is your host Awake, and this has been Mind Miss Machine. Until next time, take care of your mind and let it take care of you. So, thank you so much.